In this video I'll be showing you how I made this nano cube cliff terrarium. Let's get straight into the build. It's going to be a good one. This is a 20cm cube aquarium. I'll put a link to this plus most of the other materials I use in the description below. I'm starting off with the drainage, and for that I'm using Leaker. As I've explained before, it's extremely lightweight and porous, which makes it ideal for drainage. I use a cup to scoop some up before gently pouring it into the terrarium. Then using the back of my hand I spread it out so it's nice and even. And add a little extra. With the drainage done, it's time to move on to the next step, which is the substrate barrier. For this I'm using window screen mesh. Its holes are small enough that it doesn't let the substrate through, while still allowing water to freely pass through. I place the tank on top of the mesh and then cut it out accordingly. If you're doing this on top of a surface you don't want to get damaged, I recommend placing a cut-proof mat to protect it. This is a super old table, so I'm not too worried. With the substrate barrier cut to size, I then place it inside the terrarium and then use my hands to get it in place. Don't worry if it's a little too big, as this will only help stop the substrate from getting through. Now I'm going to place some tree fern fibre panel on top of the substrate barrier in the foreground. This stuff is a really good surface for moss to grow on. Here is the previous cube terrarium that I made, and as you can see the moss is thriving on top of the tree fern panel. I have some smaller pieces which I cut in half, which will go right at the front. Now it's time to add the substrate mix. I'm using my usual mix and I'll put it up on screen now. It's great at holding moisture, drains well and provides nutrients for the plants. These are key characteristics in a terrarium substrate. I'll be adding more substrate as we go, but for now it's time to move on to the exciting part, which is the hardscape. For this I'm using cereal stone. Its detailed appearance make it perfect for the scape that I've got in mind. I've spent a couple days prior planning the hardscape, so I've got a good idea of where everything's going to go. The vision is to create a cliff-like structure with the valley splitting off to the left. I haven't really seen this being done before, but I think it has the potential to look really nice. As you can see, this large rock creates a really nice vertical cliff face, and I'm planning to bring the substrate really high up the back to get some nice plants at the top. Now I'm placing some more rocks to build up the rest of the hardscape. It's important to take your time and enjoy the process. After all, plants can always be uprooted and moved, but hardscape cannot. So make sure you're happy with it before you move on. I add some more substrate to the back, which will create more height and in turn result in greater depth. As I mentioned earlier, I had already spent a few days designing the hardscape. It's always a good idea to spend some time designing multiple hardscapes and then picking the one you're most happy with. As you can see, the valley is starting to take shape. Here's the final rock layout for the hardscape. I made a couple changes and added a larger rock towards the back and this other smaller one at the front. Using this handy terrarium tool I gently patted the substrate down and then continued to add more substrate and then pat it down into place. As I said earlier, I'm building up the back nice and high. This will allow me to have some plants in that will look as if they're sitting on top of the cliff. Once again I gently compress it down into place. Then I'm going to do the same on the left side and build up the substrate a little higher. With a paintbrush I brushed off all the excess substrate on the rocks. I decided that I want a carpet of moss going down the centre of the valley. For this to work best, I'm once again going to use tree fern panel. I cut a section in half and then placed it in to get a rough idea of the shape it needs to be. And then using some scissors I cut out the shape accordingly. This didn't have to be exact. You don't have to use these tree fern panels, and moss will still grow well just on top of the substrate, but I found this to be the surface that moss likes best. With the valley in place, I then moved on to securing the rocks to one another. For this I used super glue and tissue. Also a quick tip, you can get these long nozzles that attach to the end of the super glue bottle. This makes it easier to get the super glue in places that would otherwise be hard to get to. I'll put a link in the description. With some tweezers I wedged some tissue in between the two rocks, and then went on to soak it in super glue. The result is a strong bond that is 100% plant safe. I've repeated this throughout the rest of the hardscape. Now all the rocks are locked to one another, it's time to move on and add some spiderwood. I picked out these 3 pieces as they best resemble what I'm trying to go for, and that is old trees sitting on top of the cliff with exposed roots growing down. I didn't like how horizontal and flat this branch was, so I decided to snap it off. As I've said in previous videos, it's a good idea to snap branches instead of cutting them. This creates a more natural look. It was also poking out the top, which would cause problems as this terrarium requires a lid. I used some pliers to snap off the top. I wanted this next piece on top of the large cliff face, but before I can get it in I had to shrink down some of the branches. I think this piece really helps bring some nice detail and interest to the terrarium. I used this smaller piece of spiderwood in the background. Using the same method as before, I went on to lock everything in place. And here's how it's looking so far. I'm really happy with it, but there's a few more things I want to do before getting the plants in. The first thing I'm doing is pinning the roots down onto the rocks. In my opinion, this really helps create the look as if they were growing over the rocks. To do this, I once again used super glue. The next thing I want to do is add some more detail with these twigs and branches. These will enhance the tree root look I'm going for. Here's how it's looking now. I decided not to go too overboard with the sticks and twigs, and I'm happy with how it looks. I also added a couple smaller rocks for detail. To cover up any exposed glue, I used super glue and then some crushed powdered rock. And here's the final hardscape. I think I've created a really nice skeleton which can then be brought to life with plants. Talking about plants, here's some of what I'll be using. Boston fern, eyelash fern, Bucephalandra, some more Bus in tissue culture, Anubias bonsai, and a plant I've never grown in a terrarium before, Trident fern. Before I can plant them, I had to remove all the plants from the rock wall. This is extremely easy to do. Just take the plant out the pot and start gently peeling off the rock wall. Try to remove as much of it as you can. Don't worry if you break a few roots in the process. Next I took the Boston fern and the eyelash fern and removed all the excess substrate until they were down to their bare root. With my hands I gently tore the plants up into smaller chunks. This won't hurt the plant and you'll end up with more plants that you can use. I started with the Boston fern. I planted the majority of it in the centre and the back of the terrarium. This plant will grow quite large and bushy, so it's important to take that into account. Next I planted the eyelash fern. This is a beautiful miniature fern that has tiny detailed leaves that, as you can probably have guessed, resemble eyelashes. As this plant doesn't grow too big, I planted it throughout the whole terrarium. Something I learned from aquascaping is that you should try and use the same plant on either side of the scape. This will create a more diverse and natural look. It's important not to let the plants dry out, so I regularly misted them. Next I'm planting the Trident fern. Similar to before, I split it up into smaller chunks. I'm going to be planting it on the left and the right side. In case you're curious of how it got its name, it's due to the trident shape of each leaf. As you may or may not know, this is an aquatic plant that typically grows underwater, but it also grows great inside terrariums. One important thing to note when planting Trident fern is that it's an epiphyte. This means the rhizome should not be planted into the substrate. Instead, just wedge it in the gaps and cracks of the rocks. Time to plant the Bucephalandra and the Anubias. As I did before, I carefully broke them up into individual plants or small clumps, and then went on to place them around the terrarium. This plant is also an epiphyte, so remember to follow the same process as the Trident fern, and not plant it in the substrate but wedge it in gaps and cracks. I added a couple more detailed rocks at the front, which I could then use to put some plants behind. With time, their roots would grow and find their way to the substrate. I then went on to plant the Bucephalandra in the same way. This is one of my favourite plants to use in a terrarium due to its dark iridescent leaves that stay relatively small. I then decided I wanted to mount some Bucephalandra onto this rock. This is super easy to do, and you could create a nice clump of plants which you can place freely around the terrarium. I simply applied a small amount of super glue and went on to pin the plant down. Don't worry, this won't hurt the plant, but try your best not to use too much super glue. I also added a small piece of Anubias at the front. I then placed the rock towards the back of the terrarium, which will fill in some space. Next I went on to planting the Bucephalandra from the tissue culture cup. Before planting, it's important to remove the gel that it's grown in. To do this, simply rinse it under some water. Using some super glue, I attached a piece to the top of the cliff edge. I'm not sure it will do well here as it may be prone to drying out, but it's worth a try. I mounted some on a small rock the same way I did before, and then planted it at the top of the terrarium. Before moving on, I gave the terrarium a good spray down. Now it's time for the moss. For this terrarium, I'm only going to be using one species, and that's Christmas moss. In good lighting, it grows low and forms a dense carpet, which is exactly what I'm looking for. I pull off small chunks and then carefully chop it up with scissors. This makes it easier to plant and it will also stimulate new growth. I make sure to push the moss down onto the tree fern panel. This will help it establish and stop it from drying out. In case you didn't know, Christmas moss is actually an aquatic species of moss. But it will also grow great inside a terrarium, so long as the humidity is kept high. I'm extremely happy with how the terrarium is looking so far, but it's not finished yet. These are springtails. They will pretty much clean the terrarium 24/7. They will eat things like mould and decaying matter, which is extremely important in a terrarium such as this one, as I use spiderwood, which is prone to growing mould. Time for a good spray down. If you can, try and avoid using tap water, and use one of the following on screen now. Regular tap water contains chemicals that could be harmful to the fine balance of the terrarium. I'm very happy with how this terrarium's turned out, and although I didn't necessarily plan it, it's got a wild jungle look, which is an extra bonus. I definitely think I've achieved my vision for this terrarium, of trees on top of cliffs with a valley in between. I should mention I also made a custom lid for this terrarium, as if it was left open it would dry out and cause the plants to die. I'm placing this terrarium on a rack under some bright LED lights, right next to the first cube terrarium build. Now here's a question for you, which one do you prefer? For me personally, I really can't decide. Thanks for making it to the end of this video. Drop a comment if you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you again soon.